Hello, friends, and thank you for tuning in today. My name is Dania, and I'm so happy that you chose to be here and to listen to this episode on the Lost Sutras podcast. I have decided to include some new episode series within this podcast. I had a lot of listeners reach out asking about specific practices and texts and lots to do with the yoga path, and asking me to share some insight and wisdom on exactly that. So, this is the first series to do just that. And through this series, we will be looking at Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. This series is called The Sutras of the Soul, what Patanjali's Yoga Sutras reveal about modern well-being. So thank you again for tuning in. Before we embark on today's episode, I invite you to join me in taking a deep, full breath. If you'd like to join me, let's take a deep inhale through the nose and exhale out the mouth. Thank you for taking this grounding moment with me. And now, let's begin. Today's episode, the first episode of this new series, is called A Map for the Soul: How This Ancient Text Can Transform Modern Well-Being. And so I'd like to begin on this conversation by questioning, why do the Yoga Sutras matter? And many of you might be coming up with your own ideas, but truly this particular text is quite universal. Compared to many of the other yoga texts that are out there, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali are focusing on a specific path of yoga known as Raja Yoga. Raja in Sanskrit translates to kingly or royal, and yoga roughly translates to union or connection. So this is looked at as like the royal path of yoga. But what we translate it to more often is the path of meditation. And so that is exactly why this text is so universal, is because what Patanjali is talking about is aspects of the mind. And these are all universal qualities. No matter where you live, what your culture is, what gender you are, what age you are, we all have a mind. And so these principles can be applied to everybody. And that is very potent. This particular series will be a journey inward, exploring wisdom that has guided seekers for thousands of years. So Patanjali's Yoga Sutras was Patanjali written between the 2nd and 5th century of our current era. This is debatable, as many scholars, aren't able to date things precisely in our modern world. But there is this theory that even though that was the potential ages that this text was written down, it was actually shared orally for potentially thousands of years before that. And so this wisdom is very ancient, it's very old. This text is not totally considered a book, but instead a collection of 196 sutras. Sutras is very close to it's a Sanskrit word, and it's very close to our English word suture. So in this way, it is thought that the sutras is like a thread that is weaving the 196 beads together. These beads, or the aphorisms, the verses within this text, are considered like malas. Think about the mala and how you count each mala bead as you go around. It's likened to that. These sutras or verses or aphorisms are very concise. They are quite poetic, and they are meant to be reflected upon and deeply integrated. This text is not recommended for beginner practitioners. It's very beneficial to have a background or experience with the path of yoga and meditation before you dive into this learning. So who Patanjali is, nobody's very quite sure about that. Patanjali could possibly have been an ancient sage who came and wrote down his own teachings in this text. There is a very beautiful, mythical, mystical story behind Patanjali that he was birthed between Anjaneya and Vayu, the wind deity, and that he arrived in his mother's palms in the form of a snake. And that is quite a mythical, again, mystical representation of who this Patanjali person was. But there is another theory out there that potentially this collection is instead a gathering of multiple scholars or teachers bringing their wisdom together, their teachings together, and offering them in a concise format. When we break down the word Patanjali a little further, Pat is translated to serpent or snake energy, and Anjali is translated to in gratitude to or in reverence to. So just from the name Patanjali, what we are looking at in this text is we are giving gratitude or reverence to the serpent energy within each of us. This serpent energy can be connected to Kundalini energy, which is considered the piece of divine consciousness that is dormant in each of us. When we explore the path of yoga or meditation or pranayama, then we can awaken this energy and be connected to cosmic consciousness or divinity, whatever term it is you want to put there. The rest of the text title, yoga, as we talked about, is often translated to union or connection. There's a much larger definition to that, but we can just leave it concise for now. And as I said previously, sutras is translated to suture or thread. So this is looked at as the thread of connection that is giving reverence to Kundalini energy. And it is done through, again, Raja Yoga, which is the path of meditation. So that's something that's really interesting about the Yoga Sutras is that it's not actually about physical postures. Very little ancient yoga texts talk about asanas. That is an evolution that we have seen in the Western world just within the last 100 years. And of course, it was birthed in India from Krishnamacharya and then some of his very famous students like Patabi Joyce, BKS Iyengar, Indra Devi, and his own son Deskachar. But the Yoga Sutras is focused on meditation. I'm going to keep highlighting that throughout this episode. So asanas or physical postures are talked about in the sutras, but in very minimal detail. Out of the 196 verses, I think there's only 2 or 3 verses that actually talk about asanas, and it doesn't talk about specific postures. It just talks about what we are trying to cultivate through these movements. What the Yoga Sutras are really focused on is the mind, inner freedom, and self-realization. And this really serves as a blueprint for awakening, balance, and inner peace. So why the Yoga Sutras still matter, because this is a very ancient text, is it answers a lot of really big questions that humans are still asking ourselves in our modern era. Things like, why does my mind feel so restless? How do I find clarity? What does it mean to live with purpose and freedom? So this is really important to notice that this is a human tendency, that the mind today is just as chaotic as it was 2,000 years ago. Distraction, stress, and overthinking aren't new. This is the human experience. And a lot of these ancient texts are exploring just that. What it means to be human and how to find balance within that. And each of these texts and each of these philosophies, not just in the yoga lineage, but all around the world, is just coming at this exact idea from different angles. So these teachings, particularly in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, are not about escaping life, but instead about learning to meet life with steadiness, wisdom, and joy. And we can really connect this with the idea of modern well-being through mindfulness, breathwork, and embodiment, which all trace back to these teachings in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and various other texts. But as I said, in this series, we are looking at this specific text. So within the text, there are 4 chapters or sections that are related to as padas. Pada in Sanskrit translates to foot, or in this essence, many people translate it to path. So the first chapter is known as Samadhi Pada, which is sometimes related to as the path of awakening. So what this text is talking about is it defines what yoga is, what we experience when we are practicing yoga, what we are experiencing when we don't practice yoga, and then the orientation of our yoga practice. So it's just a brief generalization of really what yoga is. And the entire text is actually talked about in the first 4 sutras. And that is what we're going to talk about in the next episode, known as the seed of the Yoga Sutras. Why this matters is that in our world of constant mental chatter, yoga teaches us inner stillness. And that is described in one of the very first verses or the very first sutras, Sutra 1.2. And this is probably the most famous sutra from this entire text. Yogash Chitta Vritti Nirodha. What this sutra translates to is that yoga is the stilling of the mind's fluctuations. Now, that's a very common translation of this sutra. And those who have studied the sutra or are embarking on this path may notice that there is a very masculine lens that is being used and applied to these Sanskrit verses. And so I would also like to offer one of my favorite translations from Nishala Joy Devi. And what she translates Sutra 1.2 as is that yoga is the uniting of consciousness in the heart. And for me, that feels like obviously a much more heart-centered approach. And it just paints this really lovely, gentle aspect of what yoga can create for us. The second chapter is called Sadhana Pada. It's often translated to the path of practice. And what this chapter is talking about is how we actually practice yoga. So again, yoga is the uniting of consciousness in the heart, as described in Samadhi Pada. And then in this chapter, it goes further to explain how we can actually unite consciousness in the heart or still the mental fluctuations. Patanjali offers in the very first verse of the second chapter this aspect called Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga is made of 3 components: tapas, known as discipline, svadhyaya, self-study or self-inquiry, and ishvara pranidhana, which is often looked at as devotion, surrender, or some people translate it to breath. We're going to go through Kriya Yoga in a further episode, and we will also go through this next theme that I will offer to you, and that is Ashtanga Yoga, and that is known as the Eightfold Path. This is probably one of the reasons why this text is so famous today, is because of this very systemized, practical guide of how to practice yoga. Patanjali offers it in the text in 8 very simple steps. So if you are wondering how to unite consciousness in the heart, he lays it out for you in a very simple step-by-step guide. And again, we will go through that in a further episode. And so why this all matters is that Patanjali is sharing that yoga is not just philosophy, but it truly is a lived experience. And he often refers to that potency of experiential knowledge or wisdom. The third chapter is Vibhuti Pada, or the path of transformation. This chapter is pretty hard to talk about. It's a difficult topic to share vocal wisdom about because it really truly necessitates experiential knowledge and a committed practice. So when we commit to our practice, transformation occurs. In Sanskrit, a committed continual practice is known as abhyasa. And we cultivate this through the path of Kriya Yoga, which I talked about in the second chapter, but also one of those parts in particular, tapas, which is known as discipline or dedication. Vibhuti Pada is pretty hard to talk about because it is exploring this concept known as siddhis. And these are looked at as spiritual abilities, or some people would call it like yogic superpowers or awakened powers. What it's really relaying to the reader and the student is that as the mind quiets, we access deeper intuition, clarity, and inner power. So Patanjali is talking about 3 very potent practices in the Eightfold Path that are very commonly practiced in the West today. Asana, physical postures, pranayam, breathwork, and dhyana, which is meditation. And so through these 3 practices, what a practitioner is actually doing to their body is they are removing stagnancy, which allows prana or life force energy to flow more freely. And then by removing stagnancy, we are creating more space in ourselves to accumulate more prana. Through this path of these 3 practices, we are removing stagnancy to increase flow, and we are actually increasing the volume of prana in and around our bodies. So when that happens, some of our senses may become heightened. In our modern world, this is often referred to as the clair senses, and you've probably heard this before from people who are psychics mostly, and this idea of like clairvoyance and so on and so forth. And this chapter is talking about similar abilities. And many practitioners who have this committed practice will share that they have experienced heightened abilities of some sort through their practice. The last chapter, chapter 4, is called Kaivalya. This is known as the path of liberation. What this chapter is talking about is the ultimate goal of yoga, which is freedom from suffering and the realization of our true nature. Just from that description, you can probably guess that this is a really hard aspect to just talk about. Again, this chapter requires experience. So as I said that in the last 2 chapters now, maybe you are starting to understand why this text, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, is considered a text for experienced practitioners. People who have actually lived through some of these things that he is talking about in this text, so that it can really deeply integrate with you in a way that maybe it wouldn't be able to if you didn't have those experiences. So in Kaivalya, Patanjali explores what enlightenment means in daily life, and he talks about this in a Sanskrit term called samadhi. And samadhi is looked at not as enlightenment, but a step towards enlightenment. And it really is talking about this idea of inner joy, inner bliss. You know, many people in our modern collective of well-being refer to this inner wellspring of joy, and that when we work on ourselves and heal ourselves, this inner wellspring is just continuously flowing, and nothing external will add to that inner joy. It has to come from within. And that is what samadhi is that inner joy. And so why this matters is that yoga isn't about escaping, but instead it's about being fully alive and fully present. And that is the entire practice being described in the Yoga Sutras. So now we can journey into this idea of why these teachings are important for our modern life and how we can actually apply them to our modern collective consciousness. One of the biggest takeaways from the Yoga Sutras is that yoga is not just about the practice on the mat. It's instead about how we meet life off the mat. And those lessons can be taught and experienced and deeply rooted into our beings from our practice on the mat, but they should not just end there. How can we apply them when we go out into our day-to-day lives? Another big takeaway is that well-being isn't about adding more, but instead of removing distractions to uncover what's already within us. And that is something that Patanjali talks about throughout all 4 chapters in a very in-depth basis. Each sutra is tying back to this idea. As we talked about at the beginning, if yoga is defined as uniting of consciousness in the heart, well, if we remove the distractions, then we can allow our consciousness to remain in that heart space. And then, just as I shared before, that will be applied to our daily interactions and our day-to-day life. My invitation for you to go deeper into this wisdom today is to journal and reflect on the sutra, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind, or yoga is the uniting of consciousness in the heart. And as you reflect on the sutra, I encourage you to think of your mind as a lake, noticing that as those ripples or waves on the lake still, you can see your true reflection. As a practical takeaway, I invite you to observe your mind for one day, not judging what's coming up, but just simply noticing where your mind is at. And to take this a step further, can you bring in that heart-centered approach? So this idea of yoga being consciousness uniting in the heart, how can you interact with yourself, with your community, with your environment from this heart-centered place? And as you go throughout your day, if you notice that the mental chatter starts to become quite intense, know that you can always come back to your breath. The breath is a very potent tool to still the mind and connect with your heart space. So a recap for this episode is that the Yoga Sutras provide a roadmap for navigating the mind, emotions, and spiritual growth. And in the next episode, we'll start to dive deep into some of the sutras, and we'll start to dive deeply into the ones that I really love and think are potent, but all of them are. And so I encourage you to find your own version of the sutras if you can, and reflect on these as we go deeper into them. But of course, I'm excited that you're just here and then we get to explore them together in this space. If you liked this episode, I encourage you to go and check out our website, www.wildsongyoga.com. I'll link it in the episode, and check out our upcoming courses, workshops, and mentorship opportunities. I'm very excited to share that we have the 200-hour and 300-hour Earth Wisdom Yoga Teacher Training dates for 2025 and 2026 listed up on our website. So feel free to go over to our website and check that out. We also have our free course on Earth Wisdom Yoga available on our website. So you can go onto our website and register for that course, which is offered in a slow-paced format for deep integration into your life. Thank you all so much for joining me for today's episode. Before we close out today's chat, I would like to finish off our discussion with another unified breath. So if you'd like to join me, let's take a deep inhale through the nose and exhale out the mouth. Thank you so much. From my heart to all of yours, namaste.